On the morning of September 16, 1920, Wall Street was alive with its usual rhythm. The street was narrow, crowded, and noisy. Horses pulled wagons, messengers hurried with papers, bank clerks walked quickly to their offices. The air was filled with the sound of footsteps, wheels, and voices. It was the center of American finance, the place where fortunes were made and lost every day. At the corner of Wall Street and Broad Street stood the J.P. Morgan and Company headquarters, a symbol of power. The building was strong, made of stone, with tall windows and heavy doors. Across the street was the United States Sub-Treasury, where gold reserves were kept. Around the area were banks, brokerage houses, and offices. This was the beating heart of capitalism in America. The year 1920 was heavy with tension. The war had ended less than 2 years earlier, but peace had not brought calm. Soldiers returned home to find jobs scarce. Inflation made food and rent expensive. Strikes broke out across industries. In 19 alone, there were more than 3,600 strikes across the country. Steel workers, coal miners, and longshoremen demanded better pay and conditions. Business leaders saw these strikes as threats to stability. There was also fear of radical movements. In the years before, anarchists had carried out bombings in several cities. In 1919, bombs had been sent through the mail to government officials and businessmen. One of those bombs had exploded at the home of Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer. He survived, but the event led to what became known as the Palmer Raids, where suspected radicals were arrested across the country. By 1920, the government was on edge. The word anarchist was spoken with fear. Immigrants from Italy and Eastern Europe were often blamed. Many of them were poor, working in factories or on construction sites. Some believed in radical ideas, but most were simply trying to survive. Still, suspicion fell on them. On that September morning, no one knew that danger was already moving toward Wall Street. A horse-drawn wagon was making its way through the crowd. It looked ordinary. Wagons were common. They carried goods, supplies, and mail. This one was driven by a man who did not draw attention. The wagon stopped near the Morgan Building. People walked past it without a second thought. Inside the wagon was a deadly cargo. It carried dynamite and heavy iron sash weights. The dynamite was meant to explode. The iron weights were meant to tear through the air, striking anyone nearby. It was a weapon designed to kill as many people as possible. The choice of location was not random. Wall Street was the symbol of wealth and power. J.P. Morgan was one of the most powerful men in America. His bank represented the strength of capitalism. To radicals who hated the system, this was the perfect target. The Wall Street bombing did not happen in isolation. To understand its meaning, we must step back into the world of post-World War I America, where fear, anger, and radical ideas were colliding in dangerous ways. The year 1920 was heavy with tension. The war had ended less than 2 years earlier, but peace had not brought calm. Soldiers returned home to find jobs scarce. Inflation made food and rent expensive. Strikes broke out across industries. In 19 alone, there were more than 3,600 strikes across the country. Steel workers, coal miners, and longshoremen demanded better pay and conditions. Business leaders saw these strikes as threats to stability. At the same time, the government was fighting what it called the Red Menace. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had spread fear that communism could take root in America. Newspapers carried stories of Bolsheviks and anarchists plotting against the state. Politicians warned of revolution. Ordinary citizens worried that radicals were hiding among immigrants. This fear led to the Palmer Raids. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, after surviving a bombing at his home in June 1919, launched a campaign to arrest suspected radicals. Thousands of immigrants were detained. Many were deported without trial. Among those targeted were followers of Luigi Galliani, an Italian anarchist who had preached violent revolution. They were known as Gallianists. They believed in overthrowing capitalism through direct action. They rejected voting, negotiation, and compromise. For them, violence was the only path. In 1919, Galleanists had mailed bombs to government officials and businessmen. One package exploded at Palmer's home, killing the bomber himself. Other bombs were intercepted before they could cause harm. These attacks created panic and fueled the government's crackdown. By 1920, many Galleanists were still free. They were angry about the arrests and deportations. They saw the government as an enemy. They saw Wall Street as the symbol of the system they hated. After the Wall Street bombing, investigators quickly suspected anarchists. The leaflet found near the scene pointed directly to them. It demanded the release of political prisoners and threatened more violence. The Bureau of Investigation, the forerunner of the FBI, took charge. Agents interviewed witnesses, searched for evidence, and tracked suspects. They focused on Italian immigrants, especially those linked to Galleani. But the investigation faced challenges. The bomb had destroyed much of the evidence. The wagon and its driver were blown apart. No one saw who had left it. The leaflets gave clues, but not names. The government arrested suspects, but none were charged with the bombing. Some were deported, others were released. The case remained unsolved. The bombing raised questions that divided the nation. Was it the work of anarchists? Was it revenge for the Palmer raids? Or was it part of a larger conspiracy? Business leaders demanded stronger action against radicals. Newspapers called for harsher laws. Politicians warned of foreign threats. Immigrants, especially Italians, faced suspicion and hostility. But critics argued that the government was using fear to justify repression. They said the Palmer raids had violated civil rights. They said innocent people were being punished. They said the bombing was being used to silence dissent. This debate reflected the larger struggle of the time, the balance between security and freedom, between order and justice. When the bomb went off at 12:01 p.m. on September 16, 1920, the street was instantly transformed. The blast was so powerful that it shook buildings across the financial district. Windows shattered in a radius of several blocks, with glass raining down from the tall structures that lined Wall Street. The sound was deafening, so loud that people as far away as the Brooklyn Bridge thought a cannon had been fired or that a boiler had exploded. Those closest to the wagon were killed instantly. The horse pulling the wagon was torn apart, its remains scattered across the street. Clerks, messengers, and brokers who had stepped outside for lunch were struck by iron sash weights that had been packed into the bomb to act as shrapnel. These weights, weighing several pounds each, were hurled through the air at deadly speed, embedding themselves into walls, smashing windows, and cutting down anyone in their path. The street became a scene of horror. 38 people were killed, many of them ordinary workers, stenographers, clerks, and delivery boys. More than 400 others were injured, some gravely. Witnesses described bodies lying on the pavement, some motionless, others crying out for help. Blood stained the cobblestones, mixing with shattered glass and debris. People staggered, dazed and injured, trying to understand what had happened. Survivors spoke of the sudden silence that followed the blast, broken only by screams and the sound of falling debris. A man who had been standing near the sub-treasury building recalled being thrown to the ground, his ears ringing, his clothes torn by flying fragments. Another survivor described seeing a woman collapse beside him, struck by a piece of iron that had traveled across the street. The chaos spread quickly. Office workers rushed to windows, staring in disbelief at the devastation below. Some ran into the street to help the wounded, tearing strips of clothing to use as bandages. Others fled in panic, fearing another explosion. Police officers and firemen arrived within minutes, struggling to push through the crowds. Ambulances carried the injured to hospitals, where doctors worked without pause to treat burns, broken bones, and deep wounds caused by flying metal. Among the dead were young clerks, messengers, and ordinary workers. They were not powerful bankers or wealthy investors. They were everyday people who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. One victim was a young messenger boy who had been delivering papers. Another was a stenographer who had just stepped outside for fresh air. Their names were recorded in newspapers, but their stories were often overshadowed by the larger questions of politics and power. Survivors carried scars for life. Some lost limbs. Others were blinded by glass. Many suffered burns and deep wounds. Hospitals across the city were filled with the injured. Doctors worked without pause, treating burns, broken bones, and deep wounds caused by flying iron fragments. Firefighters rushed in to clear debris, pulling apart wreckage and searching for survivors trapped under fallen stone and twisted metal. Volunteers, clerks, shopkeepers, and passers-by joined them, tearing strips of clothing to use as bandages, carrying the wounded on makeshift stretchers, and offering water to those who lay bleeding on the cobblestones. Within hours, the financial district was locked down. Soldiers from nearby barracks were called in to guard the streets, rifles slung across their shoulders. The government feared another attack, and the sight of uniformed men patrolling Wall Street added to the tension. Banks and offices closed their doors. The New York Stock Exchange, shaken by the blast, suspended trading for the rest of the day. For the first time in years, the heartbeat of American finance fell silent. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. Headlines shouted the news in bold type: "Bomb kills scores on Wall Street." Reporters crowded the scene, scribbling notes and interviewing survivors. Photographers captured images of shattered windows, scarred stone, and blood-stained streets. These photographs, printed in evening papers, shocked readers across the nation. Families in distant towns saw the destruction and realized that violence had struck at the very center of American power. The images carried weight. They showed not only the destruction, but also the vulnerability of Wall Street. The Morgan Building, once a symbol of strength, now bore scars across its stone facade. The sub-treasury building's bronze doors were dented and gouged. Wagons lay overturned, their horses dead in the street. The photographs made clear that this was not a small act of violence. It was an attack on the nation's financial heart. By nightfall, the city was restless. Crowds gathered outside police stations, demanding answers. Rumors spread quickly. Some said German agents were responsible. Others blamed Bolsheviks or anarchists. The truth was uncertain, but the fear was real. New Yorkers went to bed that night knowing their city had been struck in a way they had never imagined. In the hours after the blast, rumors spread. Some said Germany was behind it, seeking revenge for the war. Others blamed Bolsheviks, anarchists, or rival businessmen. The truth was unclear. People feared more bombs. Police searched buildings for explosives. Suspicion fell on immigrants, especially Italians. The city's foreign-born residents faced hostility. Many were questioned, some arrested, though no evidence linked them directly to the attack. The fear was not only of radicals, it was also of vulnerability. Wall Street had seemed untouchable, a fortress of wealth and power. The bombing showed that it could be struck, that even the strongest institutions were not safe. The Wall Street bombing was not just a New York tragedy, it was a national shock. Newspapers across the country carried the story. Politicians spoke of the need to defend against radicals. Business leaders demanded stronger laws. The event deepened the divide between those who wanted harsh measures against immigrants and radicals and those who warned against repression. It fueled debates about freedom, justice, and security. The New York Stock Exchange reopened the very next day, on September 17, 1920. This decision was deliberate. Leaders of the financial district wanted to show that business would not be stopped by violence. Traders returned to the floor, their voices echoing through the chamber as they resumed buying and selling. The reopening was a statement of resilience. Wall Street would continue no matter the scars outside its doors. Newspapers noted the determination, describing how the hum of commerce returned even as the streets around Broad and Wall were still littered with debris. Yet the attack had struck at the very symbol of American finance, the headquarters of J.P. Morgan and Company. The building's stone facade was pitted with holes from the iron sash weights packed into the bomb. Windows were shattered, and the heavy bronze doors of the sub-treasury across the street bore deep gouges. The company bore the brunt of the attack, both in damage and in symbolism. Ironically, J.P. Morgan himself was not in New York at the time. He was in Europe, attending to business matters. His absence spared him from the blast, but it also meant that his employees and the institution he represented carried the full weight of the tragedy. Morgan was one of the most powerful financiers in the world, and his building had been chosen as the target precisely because it symbolized wealth and authority. The fact that he was away did not lessen the impact. The attack was still seen as a strike against him and the system he embodied. Immediately after the blast, police and federal agents swarmed the scene. Detectives searched for clues among the wreckage. They collected fragments of the wagon, pieces of iron weights, and scraps of paper. They interviewed witnesses, hoping someone had seen the driver or noticed something unusual. One discovery stood out: leaflets found near the scene. They carried a message: "Free the political prisoners, or it will be sure death for all of you." The words pointed to anarchists, specifically followers of Luigi Galleani, whose group had carried out bombings in 1919. Investigators believed the bombing was revenge for the Palmer raids, which had arrested and deported many radicals. But the leaflets gave no names. They were printed anonymously. They were a clue, but not a solution. Investigators focused heavily on Italian immigrants. They were suspected of carrying out earlier bombings, including the wave of mail bombs in 1919 that had targeted government officials and businessmen. The Wall Street attack bore the hallmarks of their methods: dynamite, iron shrapnel, and a message of vengeance against capitalism and the state. Agents questioned suspects, searched homes, and monitored meetings. They infiltrated immigrant communities looking for signs of radical activity. They collected pamphlets, studied speeches, and tracked the movements of known anarchists. Yet despite their efforts, the investigation struggled to find solid evidence. One name that surfaced repeatedly was Mario Buda, a Galleanist with a reputation for skill in handling explosives. Buda was close to other radicals. Suspicion deepened when Buda left the United States soon after the bombing, returning to Italy. His sudden departure fueled the belief that he had been involved, yet no proof tied him directly to the attack. No witness could place him at the scene. No physical evidence linked him to the wagon or the bomb. The Bureau could not build a case strong enough to charge him. The investigation faced enormous obstacles. Evidence was scarce. The explosion had obliterated much of the physical material that might have offered clues. The wagon was destroyed, the driver killed, and the bomb fragments scattered. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed they saw a man leave the wagon and walk quickly toward Broadway. Others insisted they saw nothing unusual at all. The chaos of the explosion made reliable testimony difficult to obtain. Agents examined the leaflets found near the scene, which demanded the release of political prisoners. They traced the printing style to radical circles in New York, but they could not prove who had distributed them. The trail grew cold. Despite years of effort, the Bureau never solved the case. Files were kept on dozens of suspects, but none were charged. The bombing remained an open wound in the history of American justice, a crime without a conviction, a mystery without resolution. The investigation was not only about finding the bomber, it was also about politics. Business leaders demanded justice. Newspapers called for stronger action against radicals. Politicians warned of foreign threats. But critics argued that the government was targeting immigrants unfairly. They said the Palmer raids had already violated civil rights. They said the bombing was being used to justify repression. They warned that innocent people were being punished while the real bomber remained free. This debate reflected the larger struggle of the time, the balance between security and freedom. The bombing became a symbol of that struggle. Investigators pursued many leads, but none led to arrests. They examined anarchist groups in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, where Galleanist circles were known to operate. Agents traveled to immigrant neighborhoods, questioning men who had once attended radical meetings or distributed anarchist newspapers. They tracked suspects across the country, following rumors from industrial towns in New Jersey to labor communities in Massachusetts. Every lead seemed promising at first, but each one ended without proof. They studied the design of the bomb carefully, hoping to link it to known bomb makers. The wagon had carried 100 pounds of dynamite, a quantity that required skill to handle. Packed around the dynamite were 500 pounds of cast-iron sash weights, chosen to act as shrapnel. Investigators noted that this was not the work of an amateur. The construction showed planning, knowledge of explosives, and a clear intent to maximize casualties. The timing at 12:01 p.m. was precise. It was chosen to strike when the street was most crowded, when clerks and brokers stepped outside for lunch, when messengers hurried between offices, and when wagons and automobiles filled the narrow street. Whoever planned the attack had studied the rhythms of Wall Street. They knew its busiest hour. They knew where the wagon would cause the most harm. But the bomber had vanished. No one saw him escape. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. Some claimed they saw a man leave the wagon and walk quickly toward Broadway. Others insisted they saw nothing unusual at all. The chaos of the explosion made reliable testimony difficult. The explosion itself had destroyed much of the evidence. The wagon was obliterated. The horse was torn apart. Fragments of wood and metal were scattered across the street. Investigators collected what they could: pieces of iron weights, scraps of paper, bits of dynamite casing, but none of it pointed to a name. Detectives tried to trace the wagon. They believed it had been purchased second-hand, but records were incomplete. No seller could identify the buyer. The driver, whoever he was, had been killed instantly, leaving no trace of his identity. The Bureau of Investigation kept files on dozens of suspects, but none could be tied directly to the crime. The leaflets found near the scene demanding the release of political prisoners were traced to radical printers in New York, but no one admitted to producing them. Weeks turned into months, and the trail grew cold. The bombing had been carefully planned, carried out with precision, and followed by silence. No group claimed responsibility. No individual was arrested. The case became one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history. Investigators believed the leaflets found near the scene had been printed in a small shop in Brooklyn, where radical literature was often produced. The paper stock and typeface matched those used by anarchist circles in the city. Yet, despite careful tracing, they could not prove who had ordered them. No printer admitted involvement, and no witness came forward. The leaflets remained a clue without a name, a shadow pointing toward radical networks, but never revealing the hand behind them. Some detectives suspected that the bomber had been familiar with Wall Street itself. The choice of 12:01 p.m. was too precise to be random. It was the moment when clerks stepped out for lunch, when messengers hurried between offices, and when wagons crowded the narrow street. The bomber seemed to know the rhythms of the financial district, the flow of people and traffic. Investigators speculated that he might have been a worker, a messenger, or someone who had spent time in the area, blending into its daily life before striking at its busiest hour. The bombing was also one of the first major cases where federal agents worked closely with local police. The Bureau of Investigation coordinated with the New York Police Department, sharing leads and evidence. Detectives and agents interviewed witnesses together, searched homes, and monitored meetings. This cooperation set a pattern for future investigations, showing how local and federal forces could combine resources in the face of national threats. Because of the bombing, many immigrants faced hostility. In the days and weeks that followed, police questioned men in Italian neighborhoods, searching for ties to anarchist groups. Some were arrested without evidence, held for hours or days before being released. Families worried about raids, whispering about neighbors who had disappeared into custody. Workers feared losing jobs as employers grew suspicious of foreign-born employees. The bombing deepened the divide between native-born Americans and immigrants, turning daily life into a struggle against suspicion. This hostility was not new. It was part of a larger wave of fear known as the Red Scare, which had begun in 1919 after a series of strikes and bombings. Across the country, immigrants were accused of bringing radical ideas from Europe. They were blamed for labor unrest, protests, and violence. Politicians warned of Bolsheviks and anarchists plotting revolution. Newspapers carried headlines that painted immigrants as threats to American stability. The Wall Street bombing became another reason to target them. The leaflets found near the blast spoke of political prisoners, language associated with anarchist circles. Investigators quickly linked the attack to Luigi Galleani. Though no proof tied any individual to the crime, the suspicion was enough to fuel hostility. In cities across America, immigrants felt the weight of this fear. Italian workers were watched more closely. Union organizers were accused of being anarchists. Families who had come seeking opportunity now faced prejudice and mistrust. The bombing hardened attitudes, making it easier for the government to justify deportations and stricter immigration laws. The divide between native-born Americans and immigrants grew sharper. For many, the bombing confirmed their worst fears about outsiders. For immigrants, it was a reminder that they were seen not as citizens, but as suspects. The tragedy of Wall Street was not only in the lives lost, but also in the suspicion it spread, reshaping the social fabric of the nation. The bombing also affected labor movements. Workers had been striking for better pay and conditions. They wanted shorter hours and fairer treatment. But after the blast, strikes were seen with suspicion. Business leaders claimed radicals were behind labor unrest. They said unions were linked to anarchists. They used the bombing as proof that workers' demands were dangerous. This made it harder for unions to gain support. Strikes were broken more quickly. Leaders were arrested. Workers were accused of being un-American. The bombing gave employers a weapon in their fight against labor. Yet, workers did not stop. They continued to organize. They continued to demand rights. The bombing did not end the labor movement, but it made the struggle harder. The Wall Street bombing raised a question that echoed across the nation. How much freedom should be sacrificed for security? In the wake of the bombing, Italian immigrant communities began to organize defense groups. These were not armed militias, but neighborhood associations formed to protect families from raids and hostility. Members met to share information, warn one another of police actions, and provide support for those arrested. They feared that suspicion alone could lead to deportation, and they sought to shield their communities from the growing wave of mistrust. Not all voices joined the chorus of fear. Some newspapers defended immigrants, reminding readers that most were hard-working and peaceful, building lives in America through labor and sacrifice. Editorials argued that blaming entire communities for the actions of a few radicals was unjust. Yet, these voices were drowned out by louder calls for repression. The images of shattered Wall Street and bloodied workers carried more weight than words of defense. Fear spoke louder than fairness. The bombing also affected the trial of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, two Italian anarchists accused of murder during a payroll robbery in Massachusetts in 1920. Their trial began in the shadow of the Wall Street attack. Prosecutors painted them as dangerous radicals, part of the same anarchist circles suspected of the bombing. Public opinion was shaped by the climate of fear. Many believed they were convicted more for their beliefs than for the evidence. Their case became a symbol of the tension between justice and prejudice, showing how the Wall Street bombing had deepened suspicion against immigrants and radicals. In the years after the bombing, lawmakers pushed for stricter controls on immigration and radical movements. The attack was used as evidence that foreign-born radicals were dangerous. Immigration laws became tighter. The Emergency Quota Act of 1921 and later the Immigration Act of 1924 restricted the number of immigrants allowed into the United States, especially from Southern and Eastern Europe. Italians, who had been linked to anarchist groups, faced particular suspicion. The bombing showed that America's financial heart was vulnerable. In response, security increased. Police presence in Wall Street grew. Guards were stationed at banks and government buildings. The Bureau of Investigation gained more authority. The bombing was used to argue for stronger federal powers. Surveillance of radicals expanded. Files were kept on suspected anarchists, communists, and labor leaders. The Bureau of Investigation used the Wall Street bombing as a powerful argument to expand its reach. At the time, the Bureau was still a small agency with limited authority. Local police had handled most criminal investigations, while federal agents focused narrowly on interstate crimes. But the bombing, striking at the nation's financial center, was seen as proof that local forces alone could not manage threats of this scale. Bureau officials pressed Congress and the Justice Department for more resources, more agents, and broader powers. In the years that followed, this expansion laid the groundwork for what would later become the FBI's role in counterterrorism, giving the federal government a stronger hand in monitoring radicals, investigating political violence, and coordinating with local police. The attack also influenced debates about civil liberties. Some argued that repression of radicals was necessary, that the bombing showed the danger of anarchists and immigrants who rejected American institutions. They supported deportations, surveillance, and stricter laws. Others warned that freedom was being sacrificed, that innocent people were being punished, and that fear was being used to silence dissent. The bombing became a symbol of this tension, a moment when the nation struggled to balance security with liberty. In the end, the Wall Street bombing was not only an act of violence, it was a turning point in the history of American law enforcement, immigration, and civil rights. It reshaped the Bureau of Investigation, hardened suspicion against immigrants, and deepened the national debate over how much freedom should be given up in the name of safety.